I spent 40 years putting my family first. It took me one single week, lying in a hospital bed with a tube in my arm and a monitor beeping out the rhythm of a heart that had finally had enough, to learn how to put myself first. If you think you know where this story is going, stay with me anyway, because the ending is not what you expect, and neither is the beginning. My name is Dorothy Mae Coleman, and before I tell you about the week that changed everything, I need you to understand the 40 years that came before it, because you cannot understand a woman who forgets herself until you understand exactly how much of herself she gave away, one piece at a time, so quietly that even she didn't notice it was happening. I was born in a small clapboard house on the edge of a town so unremarkable, it barely had a name people outside the county would recognize. The second of 5 children, the oldest girl, which in a family like mine meant something specific and heavy. It meant that by the time I was 7 years old, I was already learning how to hold a baby on my hip while stirring a pot on the stove, already learning that my own hunger came after everyone else's, already learning that a good girl, a good woman, was measured by how much she could carry without ever once setting the load down. My mother, Dorothy Coleman, was the hardest working woman I have ever known, and I loved her more than anything on this earth. But I watched her disappear a little more every year, watched her own dreams shrink down to the size of a pinprick, and then vanish altogether, and nobody in that house ever asked her what she wanted, including me. I promised myself somewhere around age 15, standing at that same stove stirring that same pot, that I would be different. I would have a life. I would matter to myself and not just to everyone around me. I made that promise with my whole chest, the way only a 15-year-old girl can, not knowing yet how easily a promise like that gets buried under 30 years of grocery lists and school forms and somebody else's fever in the middle of the night. I met Frank Coleman at a church picnic when I was 19 years old, and I want to tell you honestly, because honesty is the only thing worth offering you here, that Frank was not a bad man. He was not cruel. He never raised his hand to me. He never called me out of my name. Frank worked. Frank came home. Frank loved his children in the only way he knew how to love, which was by staying, by not leaving, by cashing his paycheck and handing most of it over without complaint. In the world I came up in, that made him a good man, and by every measure my mother and my aunties used, I had done well for myself. We married 8 months after we met, in a small church with paper fans in every pew, because the air conditioning had broken the week before, and nobody had the money to fix it before the wedding. I wore my cousin's old dress taken in at the waist. I was happy. I want you to know that. I was genuinely, foolishly, beautifully happy. And I had no idea that happiness was about to become a word I would forget how to define for the next 4 decades. Not because it disappeared, but because I stopped checking in on whether I still had it. Marcus came first, 11 months into the marriage. A big-headed, loud-voiced baby who announced himself into the world the same way he announced himself into every room for the rest of his life. Angela came 2 years after that, quiet where Marcus was loud, watchful in a way that unsettled me sometimes, like she was already keeping score of things I hadn't said out loud yet. And then, 4 years later, when I thought we were done, when I had just started talking to Frank about maybe, someday, finishing the nursing certificate I'd abandoned when I got pregnant with Marcus, along came Renee, my baby, my surprise, my last chance at whatever it was I thought I still wanted for myself. I remember holding her in the hospital, this 3rd child I had not planned for, and feeling 2 things at once so sharply that I still remember the exact texture of that feeling 38 years later. Overwhelming love and a small, cold, private grief for the nursing certificate I now knew I would never finish. I did not tell anyone about that grief. I folded it up small and put it somewhere I thought I would never have to look at it again. That is, I think, where this story really begins. Not at the hospital bed 40 years later, but right there, in that maternity ward, with a healthy baby girl in my arms and a dream quietly zipped into a bag I would not open again until I was 62 years old. What followed were the years that most people, if they are honest, would call ordinary. And ordinary is exactly the word that makes what happened to me so dangerous, because nobody warns you about ordinary. Nobody tells you that the years will not announce themselves as they take pieces of you. There is no dramatic villain in a story like mine. No single moment you can point to and say, "There, that is where I lost myself." There is only the school play I couldn't miss, and the recital I couldn't miss, and the basketball game and the church function, and the sick days and the snow days and the days Frank worked a double, and somebody had to be home. And that somebody, every single time, without a single family meeting where it was decided, without anyone ever asking me if I minded, was me. I want to be careful here because I don't want you to think I am telling you. I resented my children because I do not, I never have. I loved raising them. I loved the sound of their feet on the stairs and the smell of their hair after a bath and the ridiculous jokes they told at the dinner table that made Frank laugh so hard he'd have to put his fork down. That love was never the problem. The problem was that somewhere in all that love, I stopped being a person with a name and became only a function, only a role, only the answer to the question, who's going to handle it? And the answer was always, Dorothy. It was always me. Until the word Dorothy started to feel like something other people used, not something I used for myself. By the time I was 35, I had given up 3 separate attempts at going back to school. By the time I was 40, I had turned down a promotion at the diner where I worked, because it would have meant evening shifts. And evening shifts meant nobody home when the children got back from school. And Frank's job never once bent for us the way mine was expected to bend. Not because he demanded it, but because it never occurred to either of us, not once in 15 years of marriage, that it could have gone any other way. By the time I was 45, my sister Loretta, who had never married, who had built a whole life doing exactly what she pleased, took me out to lunch and looked at me across the table with a kind of sadness I didn't understand yet and said, "Dorothy, when's the last time you did something just because you wanted to, not because somebody needed you to?" And I laughed at her. I actually laughed because the question seemed almost absurd to me. Like she was speaking a foreign language, like she was asking me when's the last time I flew to the moon. I told her I didn't have time for foolishness like that some of us had responsibilities, and I said it with a little edge in my voice, a little pride even, like I had won something by being the one who never stopped. Loretta didn't say anything else. She just looked at me for a long moment and changed the subject, and I have thought about that lunch more times in the last week than I can count. The children grew, the way children do, faster than you're ready for, and slower than you can bear in the hard seasons. And one by one they left the house. And I want to tell you something that nobody tells you about the empty nest, something that took me completely by surprise. The nest doesn't actually empty. Not really. Not for a woman like me. Marcus moved 40 minutes away and married a woman named Charlene, who worked full-time. And when their first son was born, guess who got the call every time daycare closed early? Every time there was a doctor's appointment on a work day? Every time Charlene needed just a little help? That somehow turned into 3 days a week. Angela moved to the city, got her degree, the one I never got, and I was proud of her in a way that had a strange ache buried underneath the pride. And every time her life got complicated, a breakup, a job loss, a landlord problem, she called her mother, and her mother dropped everything and drove or wired money or stayed up half the night on the phone talking her through it. Renee, my baby, struggled the most, in and out of relationships that weren't good for her, in and out of jobs, and more than once, more than 5 times if I'm being truthful, she and her 2 children came to stay with Frank and me for just a few weeks that stretched into months, and I cooked and I cleaned and I got those babies to school, and I never once, not one single time, sat down and asked myself whether I had anything left to give, because the question itself felt like a betrayal. Good mothers didn't ask that question. Good mothers just gave. Frank retired when he turned 62, and I remember thinking, foolishly, that this would be my turn, that with the children grown and Frank home and the mortgage paid off, I would finally have some space to breathe, to think about what Dorothy wanted, whoever Dorothy was by then, because I honestly wasn't sure I remembered. But Frank's retirement did not open up space for me. It filled up whatever little space I had left because Frank, God love him, did not know what to do with himself outside of a work schedule. And so I became his schedule too, his entertainment, his reason to get up in the morning. And I told myself this was just what marriage looked like at our age. This was just the season we were in, and next season surely, next season would be mine. I kept saying that. Next season. For years I kept saying that. The way you keep believing a bus is coming even after you've been standing at the stop so long. The sun has moved across the whole sky. I want to pause here and tell you about a specific Tuesday, because I think about this Tuesday more than almost any other day in my whole life, and it happened only about 3 years before the week that finally changed me. Which tells you something about how long a person can go on ignoring the signs that something is deeply, dangerously wrong. I was 60 years old. I had just finished cooking Sunday dinner for 14 people, my whole family plus Charlene's mother, who'd come to visit, and I was standing at the sink with my hands in dishwater that had gone cold an hour ago, and my back was screaming, and my feet had swollen up over the sides of my house shoes, and I heard laughter coming from the living room, all of them, my children and my grandchildren and my husband, laughing at something on the television, warm and easy and completely unaware that the woman who had fed them and would clean up after them and would be the first one awake the next morning to do it all again, was standing alone in the kitchen feeling something I did not have a name for at the time, but now know was simply grief. Grief for a life I had not lived. I did not cry that day. I dried my hands and I went and sat with my family, and I laughed along with them because that is what you do. That is what I always did. But something in me noticed, for just a moment, cracked open just a sliver, and then I closed it right back up because there was a load of laundry waiting, and Renee's youngest needed help with a book report, and the world simply did not stop long enough for Dorothy Coleman to sit with her own grief. I tell you all of this not to make you feel sorry for me, because I do not want your pity. I never have. But because I need you to understand exactly how deep a habit like mine can run, how many decades it can quietly compound before something finally forces the reckoning. And the reckoning, when it came, did not come gently. It came on a Thursday afternoon in March at Angela's daughter's birthday party, a party I had insisted on catering myself even though Angela had begged me, actually begged me, to just let her order from a restaurant, because, "Mama, you do too much. Please just sit down this one time." I had waved her off. I had told her I didn't know how to sit down at my own granddaughter's birthday party while other people worked, and I had spent 2 full days making a cake from scratch. A cake shaped like a castle with turrets I built out of ice cream cones. And I was proud of that cake in a way that scares me a little now, because I think some small hidden part of me believed that cake was proof I still mattered, proof that all this giving still added up to something. And I was carrying that cake, that ridiculous beautiful castle cake, out to the dessert table when the left side of my chest seized up like a fist closing around my heart, and the room tilted, and I remember thinking, with a strange floating calm, "Not now. There are children here. Not now." As if I could negotiate with my own body the way I had negotiated my own needs, down to nothing for 40 years. And then the cake was on the floor, the castle in pieces on Angela's kitchen tile. And I was on the floor, too. And the last thing I heard before the world went soft and gray at the edges was my granddaughter, 7 years old, screaming for her mother, and Angela's voice. A voice I had never heard come out of my daughter before, sharp and terrified, and cracking down the middle, screaming my name. I woke up in a hospital room 2 days later, and I want to tell you what I remember first, because it matters. I did not first think about Frank. I did not first think about my children, or my grandchildren, or the mess I had surely left behind, the birthday party ruined, the cake destroyed. The very first thought that crossed my mind, before I even opened my eyes all the way, before I even registered the beeping monitor or the IV taped into the back of my hand, was this: I get to lie here. Nobody needs me to get up. And underneath that thought came a wave of guilt so powerful, it nearly stopped my heart a second time. Guilt that my first instinct, lying half-conscious in a hospital bed, after what the doctors would later tell me, was a heart attack brought on by years of untreated hypertension, chronic exhaustion, and stress my body had been absorbing silently for decades, was relief. Not fear, not worry for my family. Relief. I lay there and I cried, quietly, so the machines wouldn't tell anyone in the hallway I was upset, because 40 years of habit does not switch off just because your heart nearly stopped. And I cried because I did not recognize the woman inside my own chest who felt relieved to finally be allowed to stop. The doctor who came to see me that first morning I was fully conscious was a serious, soft-spoken woman named Dr. Patricia Ashworth, and she sat on the edge of my bed, which surprised me because doctors rarely sit. And she looked at my chart, and then she looked at me, and she said something I will remember on my deathbed, whenever that day finally comes. She said, Mrs. Coleman, your heart is going to heal. The medicine, the procedure we did, that part I can handle. But I am looking at the labs and the history here, and I need to ask you something. And I need you to actually think about the answer, instead of giving me the answer you think I want to hear. When is the last time anyone took care of you? And I opened my mouth to say something automatic, something about how I was fine, how I didn't need anybody fussing, and the words just would not come out. I sat there in that hospital bed with my mouth half open, and I could not answer her, because I genuinely, truly did not know. I could not remember. 40 years, and I could not name a single stretch of time, not a week, not a weekend, not even a single full day, that had belonged only to me. Dr. Ashworth told me I needed a minimum of 1 full week of complete rest. No stress, limited visitors, no cooking, no cleaning, no driving anyone anywhere, no phone calls that would raise my blood pressure. And she said it in a tone that left no room for negotiation. And I remember thinking, even in that moment, that it was almost comical. The idea that a doctor had to write a prescription an actual medical order, for the one thing I had never once in 40 years given myself permission to do. But she was serious. And Frank, standing in the corner of that hospital room, looking smaller and more frightened than I had ever seen him in 39 years of marriage, nodded and said, "Whatever she needs, doctor, whatever she needs." And I want to tell you, that was the moment the week began, not the day I was discharged, but that exact moment, because for the first time in longer than I could remember, someone had drawn a line around my needs and dared my family to respect it. The nurse who cared for me most during those first days was a woman named Yvonne Whitfield. And I need to tell you about Yvonne, because without her, I am not sure this story ends the way it does. Yvonne was maybe 50, with locks pulled back in a low bun and reading glasses pushed up on her head. And she moved through that hospital room with an efficiency that had no wasted motion in it. And on my second full day awake, while she was checking my vitals, she noticed the way I flinched every time my phone buzzed on the little tray table. My children calling, my grandchildren wanting to know if Grandma was okay. And Yvonne, without asking permission, without being dramatic about it, simply reached over and turned my phone face down. "Not today," she said. "Today you don't have to answer to anybody." And I laughed, a small nervous laugh, and said something about how my family would worry. And Yvonne looked at me with an expression I can only describe as gentle and unimpressed at the same time. And she said, "Mrs. Coleman, your family has phones too. They can call each other. You are not the only working part of that machine, even though I suspect you've spent 40 years believing you were." I did not know, sitting there with a tube in my arm, and my heart still learning how to beat properly, again, that a stranger's sentence could crack something open in me that 4 decades of quiet grief had not managed to crack. But it did. It cracked me right open, Monday of that week, if I'm being exact about it, because I have gone back over every single day since. I mostly slept, and when I wasn't sleeping, I was crying. Not the careful, contained tears I had learned to cry my whole life, tears that could be finished quickly and wiped away before anyone noticed, but real crying, the kind that comes from somewhere so deep you don't fully understand what you're grieving, only that you are grieving something enormous. Frank came to visit that evening, and he sat by my bed holding my hand, and he said, "Dottie, the kids want to come see you," using the name only he had ever used for me, a name I had not heard in years because somewhere along the way, even that had gotten worn down to Mama and Grandma and Mrs. Coleman, and I looked at my husband, this man I had built an entire life alongside, and I said, "Not yet, Frank. Tell them I love them. Tell them not yet." And watching his face, I saw something register there, something like confusion, because in 39 years I had never once told my children not yet. I had never once put a closed door between myself and their needs. Frank didn't argue with me. He just nodded slowly, like a man recalibrating an instrument he'd been reading wrong for decades. And he kissed my forehead, and he left, and I lay there in the dark hospital room and felt, underneath the exhaustion and the grief, something else stirring, something small and unfamiliar that I would later recognize as the first flicker of my own voice. Tuesday. Dr. Ashworth came back, and this time she didn't just check my chart. She pulled up a chair, an actual chair, and sat down across from me like we had time, like I was worth spending unhurried time on. And she asked me questions nobody had asked me in decades. Not, "What does your family need?" Not, "Who's picking up the kids?" But questions like, "Mrs. Coleman, if I told you that you had 1 week left on this earth to do exactly what you wanted, no obligations, what would you do with it?" And I sat there, 62 years old, and I could not answer. I genuinely could not answer. The question felt like it was written in a language I used to speak fluently as a girl, and had simply forgotten, word by word, year by year, until I no longer had access to it at all. I told Dr. Ashworth told her honestly, that I didn't know what I wanted anymore, that I wasn't sure I'd ever really known, or if I had known once, a long time ago, at 19, at 15, at 7 years old, stirring a pot on my mother's stove, and Dr. Ashworth did not rush to fill the silence with reassurance the way people usually do. She just let it sit there, heavy and honest between us, and then she said, "That's all right. You have a week. Some people spend their whole lives never asking the question at all. You get to start now." I did not know it yet, but that sentence was the hook that would pull me through the rest of that week, and honestly, through the rest of my life. You get to start now. Wednesday, my sister Loretta came, the one visitor I did agree to see, because Loretta had never needed me to be anything other than exactly who I was, and she sat on the edge of that hospital bed, the way she used to sit on the edge of my bed when we were girls sharing a room, and she held my hand, and she cried, actually cried. My strong, unmarried, independent sister, who had built her whole life doing what she pleased, and I asked her why she was crying, because I was the one in the hospital bed, and she said something that undid me completely. She said, "Well, Dorothy, I have spent 30 years watching you disappear a little bit at a time, and I never knew how to say it to you without you thinking I was attacking your family, because you love them. I know you love them. But loving them was never supposed to cost you your whole self. And I was scared, so scared, that it was going to take exactly something like this for you to finally hear me. And I thought about that lunch 15 years earlier. When's the last time you did something just because you wanted to? And I thought about how I had laughed at her, actually laughed. And I said through tears that would not stop coming, "I heard you, Loretta." It just took my heart nearly stopping for me to actually listen. We sat there together for 2 hours, not talking about my family, not talking about anybody's needs but mine. And Loretta asked me the question Dr. Ashworth had asked, what did I want? And this time, slowly, painfully, like pulling something up from the bottom of a well that had been sealed shut for decades, an answer started to come. I told her I used to want to be a nurse. I told her I used to love to paint, actually paint, with real paint and real canvas, something I had done exactly twice in my entire adult life, both times at church craft fairs, both times rushed and interrupted by somebody needing something. I told her I used to dream, as a young girl, of seeing the ocean, because I had grown up landlocked and had never once in 62 years stood at the edge of an actual sea. Loretta listened to every word like it was the most important information she had ever received. And by the time she left that evening, something in me had shifted permanently, because I had said those wants out loud for the first time in my adult life, and the ceiling had not fallen in, and nobody had needed anything from me in exchange for saying them. Thursday was the day my children finally came, all 3 of them. Marcus and Angela and Renee, standing at the foot of my hospital bed, looking like children again, despite their gray hairs and their own grown children waiting at home. And I watched their faces as they took in how small I looked in that bed, how the machines still monitored my heart, and I felt the old pull start immediately, the pull to comfort them, to tell them I was fine, to manage their fear the way I had always managed. Everyone's fear but something in me, something new and still fragile, held its ground. And instead I let them see me tired. I let them see me scared. I let Angela cry, without immediately trying to fix her crying. And I let Marcus pace the small room, with his hands shoved in his pockets, without rushing to reassure him, and I let Renee sit in the corner chair not saying much of anything, which was Renee's way of being afraid, and I simply existed in front of them, weak and honest, instead of performing strength I did not actually have. And it was one of the hardest, most unnatural things I had ever done, sitting still in my own vulnerability, instead of rushing to smooth it over for everyone else's comfort. And then Marcus said the thing that became, without either of us knowing it in the moment, the true climax of that whole week, the moment everything either broke or was finally built new. He said, trying to be helpful, trying in his own way to take care of me. "Mama, don't worry about anything. When you get home, we'll figure out a schedule, so somebody's always there to help you get back on your feet, cook your meals, keep the house up. You won't have to worry about a thing." And he meant it kindly. I want to be fair to my son because he meant every word of it kindly, but something inside me finally, after 40 years, simply refused to bend the way it always had. I sat up straighter in that hospital bed than I had all week, and I looked at my 3 grown children, and I said, in a voice that did not shake even though my hands were shaking underneath the blanket, "No. Just that. No." And the room went completely silent. Silent in a way I had never once experienced with my family, because in 40 years I do not believe I had ever said that single word to any of them about anything that concerned my own needs. Angela said, "Mama?" Like she wasn't sure she'd heard correctly. And I said it again, louder this time, stronger. "No. I am not building a schedule for people to come take care of the house and cook the meals so that I can go right back to doing exactly what put me in this hospital bed in the first place. I have spent 40 years making sure every single one of you had what you needed. Every meal, every ride, every late-night phone call, every crisis. And I did it gladly. I want you to hear me say that. I did it because I love you with everything in me. But I nearly died on your sister's kitchen floor holding a cake I built with my own 2 hands because I did not know how to sit at my own granddaughter's party like a guest instead of like staff. And I am not doing that anymore. I am not going to spend whatever years I have left the same way I spent the last 40. I am going to rest. I am going to figure out what Dorothy actually wants. Not what Mama wants, not what Grandma wants, what Dorothy wants. And I need you all, every single one of you, to let me do that without making me feel guilty for it." Nobody said a word for a long moment. I watched something move across each of their faces, something I can only describe as a kind of reckoning of their own, because I do not think, not once in their whole lives, had it occurred to any of my children that their mother was a whole separate person with wants of her own, not because they were cruel, but because I had never once given them reason to think otherwise. I had built the very cage I was now, for the first time, refusing to climb back into. Renee was the one who finally broke the silence, and she surprised me, because Renee, my baby, the one who had struggled the most, the one who had leaned on me the hardest and the longest, was the one who stood up, walked over to the bed, and took my hand, and said, "Okay, Mama, okay. What do you need from us?" And that question, so simple, so overdue, nearly broke me all over again, because in 40 years, my own daughter had never once needed to ask me that, because I had never once given her the chance to. I had always simply known and simply provided, without ever leaving room for anyone to ask what I might need in return. I told them, slowly, still figuring it out even as I said it, that what I needed was time. I needed them to stop calling every single day, expecting me to solve their problems. I needed Frank to learn how to cook something besides toast. I needed Sunday dinners to stop, at least for a while. or to happen at somebody else's house for a change, made by somebody else's hands. I needed more than anything for my family to understand that loving me did not mean needing me, that those were two very different things that had gotten tangled together in all of our minds for 4 decades, mine most of all. Friday came, and something had shifted in the room, in the whole hospital it seemed, though of course it was only shifting inside me. Dr. Ashworth came by and found me sitting up looking, she said, like a different woman than the one she'd admitted 5 days earlier. And she asked me what had changed, and I told her about Thursday, about the word no finally living in my mouth after 40 years of exile. And she smiled, the first real smile I'd seen from her all week. And she said something I have carried with me every single day since. She said, "Mrs. Coleman, your heart didn't just have a physical event this week. It had an overdue conversation with the rest of you. Some people never let their heart finish that conversation, and they don't survive the second attack or the third. You got a warning most people don't get to walk away from. Don't waste it by going back to exactly who you were." I asked her, half joking, half terrified, what I was supposed to do instead at 62 years old, with a healing heart and 40 years of habits built into my very bones. And she said something simple that I have repeated to myself nearly every day since. You don't have to figure out the whole rest of your life today. You just have to figure out what Dorothy wants tomorrow. And then the day after that, you figure out the next tomorrow. That's all any of us are really doing anyway. I want to tell you about the weekend, because the weekend is when the ocean came back into it, in a way I did not expect. Loretta, who I mentioned had never married, who had spent her whole adult life doing exactly as she pleased, which some of the family had quietly judged her for over the years, though never to her face, sat by my bed on Saturday and told me she had a proposal, and she said it like she'd been waiting all week to say it, holding it carefully until the right moment. She told me that she was retiring at the end of the year from her job managing a dental office, and that she had always planned to take a trip somewhere, warm and near water, and that she wanted me to come with her, not someday, not next season, but as soon as Dr. Ashworth cleared me to travel, whenever that might be, weeks or months down the line, and that she would wait for me, however long it took, because she said, and I will never forget the exact words, "Dorothy, you have been waiting your whole life for permission from somebody else to want something. I am not going to be one more person you wait on. I'm asking you now, and I need you to actually answer me, instead of telling me you'll think about it. Which is what you always say when you've already decided no. Do you want to see the ocean or not?" And I sat there in that hospital bed, 62 years old, heart still healing, and for the first time in longer than I could measure, I said yes to something purely because I wanted it, with no calculation of who it would inconvenience, no mental math about whose needs came first. I just said yes, and I cried again, but this time it wasn't grief. I want you to understand that distinction, because it matters more than almost anything else in this whole story. For 40 years, my tears had almost always been about loss, quiet, private, swallowed loss. This time, for the first time in longer than I could remember, I was crying because something good was actually, finally, arriving. I was discharged on Sunday, exactly 1 week after I collapsed on my daughter's kitchen floor, holding a cake shaped like a castle. And I want to tell you honestly that walking out of that hospital did not magically fix 40 years of habit overnight, because that is not how real change works. And I don't want to stand here and tell you a fairy tale, because fairy tales don't help anybody actually change their lives. What that week gave me was not a finished transformation. It gave me a beginning, a hinge point, a place where the story of my life quietly split into before and after. Frank picked me up, and on the drive home he was quiet for a long while, and then he said, "Dottie, I've been thinking all week, and I think I've let you carry too much for too long, and I didn't even see it happening, and I'm sorry for that, and I want to learn how to cook something besides toast." It was such a small thing, such an almost funny thing to say after everything. But I laughed, really laughed, for the first time in that whole difficult week, and Frank reached over and held my hand at a red light. And I thought, maybe, just maybe, 40 years wasn't too late to start building something a little more honest. In the weeks that followed, things did not become perfect, because that is not how any of this works, and I would be doing you a disservice if I let you believe otherwise. Marcus struggled with the new boundaries at first, called less, but also, for the first time, called Charlene's own mother when they needed help with the baby, instead of automatically calling me. And I felt a strange mix of relief and grief watching that shift happen, because even letting go of the parts of yourself that were exhausting you can still feel like loss. And both of those feelings, I learned, are allowed to live in the same chest at the same time. Angela started ordering catering for family events, and the first time I saw a store-bought cake at a family birthday party instead of one I had built myself, I felt a flash of the old guilt rise up in my throat, the old voice telling me I was failing somebody by not doing it myself, and I sat with that feeling instead of acting on it, and it passed. The way Dr. Ashworth had told me feelings do, when you let them move through you instead of immediately obeying them. Renee, my baby, my last chance, started calling me not just when she needed something, but sometimes just to talk, just to ask how I was doing, actually doing, not performing, doing fine. And those calls became some of the most precious minutes of my whole week. 6 months after I left that hospital, Loretta and I stood together on a beach, real sand under our feet, real salt air in our lungs, and I stood at the edge of the water, 62 years old, and watched the waves come in and go back out, again and again, patient and enormous and completely indifferent to every single thing I had spent 40 years believing I had to carry. And I cried for the 3rd time in this story. But this time it was neither grief nor relief. It was something closer to arrival. The feeling of a woman finally meeting a version of herself she had put off meeting for 4 entire decades. I stood there and I thought about my mother, Dorothy Coleman, who never got a week like the one I got, who disappeared a little more every year with nobody ever asking her to stop. And I made a promise to her, standing in that water, that I would spend whatever years I had left living the life she never got permission to want, not out of guilt, but out of love. Love for her. Love for the girl I used to be at 15 standing at that same stove. Love, finally, for the woman I had become. I think about that week almost every single day now. I think about Yvonne Whitfield turning my phone face down and telling me I wasn't the only working part of the machine. I think about Dr. Ashworth asking me what I would do with 1 week if it were my last, and how I couldn't answer her, and how devastating it is that so many of us cannot answer that question until our bodies force the issue for us. I think about Loretta holding my hand and refusing to let me disappear the way our mother did. And I think about my son, standing at the foot of my hospital bed, trying to build me a schedule of care that would have simply put me right back on the path that nearly killed me. Meaning, well, loving me completely, and still nearly costing me everything, because that is how deep these patterns run in families. How many generations they can travel through, unless somebody, somewhere, finally says the word no and means it. If you are listening to this, and some part of you recognized yourself in Dorothy Coleman, if some part of you has spent years or decades putting everyone else's needs so far ahead of your own that you can no longer remember what your own voice even sounds like, I am not going to tell you that you need a heart attack to change, because I pray with everything in me that you don't, that you get to choose this before your body forces the choice for you the way mine did. I am asking you the way Loretta asked me, to actually answer the question instead of deciding you'll think about it later. What do you want? Not what does your family need, not what does your job need, not what does everybody else's crisis need from you today, but what do you, the actual person underneath all those roles, genuinely want? Sit with that question the way I finally had to sit with it in that hospital bed, and I promise you, it is never too late to start, whether you're 25 or 62 or 90. It is never too late to finally put yourself on the list of people worth taking care of. If this story moves something in you, if you saw pieces of your own mother, or your own grandmother, or your own reflection in Dorothy Coleman's 40 years of quiet giving, I want to hear about it, so please drop a comment below and tell me your own story. Tell me about the moment, big or small, when you finally learned to put yourself first. Or tell me if you're still waiting for that moment, still waiting for permission. You haven't given yourself yet, because somebody else reading these comments needs to hear that they are not alone in this. And if you want more stories like Dorothy's, stories about real women finding their voice after decades of silence, make sure you hit that subscribe button so you don't miss what comes next. And give this video a like before you go, because it truly helps this story reach the next woman out there who is standing at her own sink with her hands in cold dishwater, listening to laughter in the next room, wondering if she is allowed to want more. You are allowed. It only took me a week to learn that, after 40 years of not knowing, and I am telling you now, so that maybe it won't take you nearly as long. Thank you for staying with Dorothy's story all the way to the end. I will see you in the next one.